Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us at this panel discussion of this terrific and timely film, Coded Bias, by Shalini Kantayya. My name is David Bland, and I'm a member of the TNEC International Film Festival, as well as being a longtime member of one of our co-sponsor organizations, the Ethical Culture Society of Bergen County. And my wife, Susan Lesh, and I are also local co-sponsors of tonight's film. Coded Bias will premiere nationally on PBS on March 22nd, that's a Monday, at 10 p.m. For those of you in the New York, New Jersey area, that would be on WNET Channel 13. And the film that will be shown on PBS will be somewhat longer than the one you just saw tonight. We are extremely fortunate to have three panelists tonight, each an expert in their own area. Gurbir Grewal is the Attorney General of New Jersey, and we're honored to have him. Karen Thompson is a senior staff attorney at the American Civil Liberties Union of New Jersey. And Professor Riad Nasser of Fairleigh Dickinson University is a sociologist and an expert on artificial intelligence technology and social change. If you have any questions for us, please put it in the chat window. I can't promise to get to all the questions that you have, but I'll do as many as I can. I'd like to open with a question for Attorney General Grewal. In late January, you made an important announcement about the use of AI for facial recognition. Could you tell us about that?
Sure. Thank you, David, for having me. We made an announcement that we were putting a hold on law enforcement use of facial recognition technology. At the time, our decision was prompted by a company called Clearview AI. And we had learned that Clearview AI was giving its product free to law enforcement agencies for them to use to take images and run it against their database to identify individuals for investigative purposes. There were a number of things that were problematic about Clearview AI, but at the time, first and foremost was the fact that they amassed their database of billions of images by really just scraping social media in violation of terms of use with Facebook and other social media platforms. And the manner in which they amassed this database, the data they were collecting from law enforcement uses of the database, the way they were using law enforcement's use of the database to promote their product, including images of me at a press conference talking about a case that was made where we used a different facial recognition platform, state police platform, to identify individuals. They somehow linked it in a promotional advertisement to their product. So, that gave us reason to just hit pause and learn more about what goes into this technology, the accuracy of it, the vendors that are out there. And so we're undergoing a really thorough review of the technology and how we could use it with guardrails on it. And I could talk more about that throughout the program, but we see it as an investigative tool, not something where we could get an arrest warrant based on it or a search warrant based on it, but really just a way to help us in certain investigations. And I have some thoughts on the guardrails that we can put on it too.
Now, your order only covered Clearview, right? Not other tools. So why only Clearview, and would you expand it to other tools, do you think?
Yeah, I think the process we're undergoing right now, I think what we'll see with respect to the guidelines that we put out is the type of tools that we'll approve, under what conditions we'll approve a tool, what standards they have to meet, what standard of accuracy should be met. For example, NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology, reviews algorithms, and they've done studies on this about the accuracy of these algorithms, and so we're looking at what should the baseline of accuracy be? Is it X number, Y number, Z number, and once we have a verified algorithm, then what are the other sort of limits that we're going to put it on? We don't want it to be used for dragnet purposes. We don't want it to be constantly running in a town center and looking at people's images and running it against the database. We don't want to have law enforcement officers indiscriminately use it. We want to have other guardrails in place to make sure law enforcement exhausts other means before they resort to this technology. And then when they resort to this technology, we want to look at issues as to whether or not it is truly for an investigation. Do they have a known image that they're running against a database to identify a witness, a victim, or a perpetrator of a crime, a serious crime? So in what crimes can we use this technology for? We want to use it to, for example, detect people who are not able to identify themselves. Sometimes we encounter deceased individuals without identification, or people who are mentally incapacitated. Those are the types of uses that we're looking at this technology as a possible for a possible use. But we want to put serious guardrails on it, because as the movie amplifies, it can be abused.
Now, in the town where I live, Teaneck, the council just put a blanket ban on the use of AI for facial recognition. But you mentioned that the state police uses some other tools. So right now today, I know you've banned Clearview in New Jersey, but are other tools being used by other agencies?
So we have our own databases that we use. That state police maintains one. We have trained individuals who are authorized to use probe images, so images where you have somebody who you're trying to identify against that state police database, where we know where that data set comes from. Again, even now, we don't use it for probable cause in a search warrant or in an arrest affidavit. It is a tool to generate a lead in an investigation. And I will say this, the movie talks about in the beginning the accuracy of some of the algorithms and some of the numbers. And then in the long version that I watched, it's at the 60-minute mark where they also talk about, how some of these algorithms actually improved, how some of these technologies were able to improve, and the numbers, the disparities were lessened. And I've also looked at more recent studies. Again, NIST has put some out where, the best of these algorithms, the error rates are not that high in some cases. There's still biases, and we don't want to use a product that has those biases. And we want to make sure we have ways to, whether it's submitting it to NIST for their review or other verifying agencies. So I'd say that just to say, those numbers, when you have a known image and you're running against this data set, there is error, but it's a small number. What concerns me for identification more, and Karen could probably speak to this, given her background at ACLU and at the Innocence Project, is that faulty eyewitness testimony results in more wrongful convictions than anything else. I think, eyewitness testimony is probably one of the least reliable forms of evidence that we have in criminal cases when you're leaving it to a human being. So I say that just as a point of comparison that, there are issues with the facial recognition technology. We recognize that. We don't want it to be widely used. We want it to be used in a responsible manner in law enforcement for limited purposes. But we should also recognize the human error that comes into place when, something like 50% or so of wrongful convictions come from bad human IDs. And when sometimes you'll compound both when you have cases where you get a lead from an algorithm, you bring it to somebody to say, is this the person you saw? And then then they're wrong too. And we've seen those cases as well. So we need to be careful in all cases. And, the movie really raises a lot of questions that we need to address and wrestle with. I think the movie, my part of this is a narrow part of this. There are concerns that I have about, social media platforms using algorithms to drive people who are like-minded together. Bigots finding community online because of the algorithms that Facebook uses. I have a lot of concerns about, as they were saying about the Facebook patent at the end of the movie, about being able to target people because you could identify who they are and then target them with an ad or, in a shopping environment. I mean, that's troubling, when data is being harvested like that. And so there are a whole lot of different uses for this technology and a whole lot of opportunity for misuse. And on that Facebook side of it, the AG's consumer protection side of the house, or the other side of our house, we're looking at that too to try to hold those platforms accountable for those algorithms as well.
Well, you've raised a host of good issues, and I'd like to come back to them. I think this is also a good lead-in to a question for Professor Nasser. I think our audience should get a better background in how this technology works, because I think it will surprise a lot of people. I worked as a computer programmer in the financial industry for decades, and every program I wrote was basically a cookbook. Do this, then do that. If A, then do B. If X, then do Y, etc. And although my programs could be long and very complicated, any human being who had a technical knowledge could read them and understand them. But in the film, the AI experts said that this was not the case with AI, that sometimes the computer would come to a decision that its architects could not explain. So, Professor Nasser, could you explain that to us?
Okay, first of all, good evening. Thank you for having me. And I would like to start with a basic definition. What's an algorithm? Basically, algorithm is basically a step-by-step instructions aimed at achieving a certain task. It's like your cookbook. And those step-by-step instructions help people build those machines. So there are two types of algorithms. The one that they call the rule-based algorithms, like the cookbook, and the other one is the deep learning. Now, humans have invented technologies in order to improve their lives and in order to make their, the quality of life and to make their lives better. However, in this case, technology, when we talk about deep learning, meaning that we are playing here the role of God. We are trying to create machines that they have the ability, when we feed them with basic instructions or some instructions, to do the work on their own, to make decisions on their own. In other words, we are creating a kind of independent entity, like someone, I may use the concept of golem, as kind of a creature, a monster, that basically we are creating that it has its independent life. And once that entity or that creature become independent, they will make their own decisions, okay? Just to give you an example, for facial recognition, there was a study conducted in Japan, and they changed 1 pixel in the image, and the camera could, or the artificial intelligence device designed to recognize faces, could not distinguish between a dog and a car. Just 1 pixel, if you change in that image. So apparently, with this facial recognition, there are a lot of mistakes, a lot of errors, that you basically classify people as at risk and danger to the public safety, and they are innocent people. So we are using machines in this way in order to control society, to manipulate society in some way, which infringes on their basic human rights, basic privacy, and many other issues.
Sorry, go ahead. Go ahead, sorry.
Follow up with your question.
Yeah, so, when we spoke the other day, you gave me an amazing example of a case where I forget if it was a civil or criminal matter, but the plaintiffs asked for the explanation of why the machine came up with a decision that it came up with, and no one could have an answer for that. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, so that was in Idaho. Basically, was talking about Medicaid benefits for citizens of Idaho, and they changed their software. And suddenly, many people realized that either their benefits were reduced dramatically, and for some, they were increased dramatically without explanation. Of course, those who their benefits were increased did not complain. Those whose benefits were decreased went and said, what's going on here? Why I'm getting less money? Why I'm not getting these services? And they found out after they went to court and the deliberation and all those waste of time, they found out that the company changed its software. Initially, they refused to share with the court what was this, how the software operates and how it was designed. They said it's a company secret. Later on, after the court insisted, they found it just simple spreadsheets. And that simple spreadsheet made calculation based on your age, based on your race, based on many other factors that they have nothing to do with your benefits and your eligibility to get that. The other issue, the other cases in the criminal justice system that they use algorithm to grant parole to offenders or not to grant parole. Those systems, as I mentioned before, are made by human beings. And like in the Old Testament, the New Testament, in the Quran, they say that we humans are created in the image of God. Those people who are engineers design those machines in their own image. So it's really influenced by your gender, by your race, by your ethnicity, by your many other factors, your social class, and many other factors. So those machines, those algorithms are very biased. I don't want to put a percentage on it, but certainly in the United States, they are biased against African American, for working class people. They're more likely to deny parole for working African American offenders and for working class people. Okay, so in those cases, you notice that there is a link between the engineer, his or her own background, education, social class, etc., his or her own worldview, and how they feed the machine with certain information that is basically a derivative of their own. It's their own image. And certainly their own image doesn't really fit into the general public image, the diversity of society, the different ages, the complex nature of the human beings in general.
Now, for sake of context, are there other areas that in different subject areas where AI is used successfully and without controversy?
In medicine, in pathology, for example, they use that successfully, especially for women, for breast cancer, identifying, cancerous cells. But they did also an experiment with pigeons, and pigeons identified cancerous cells 85% of the cases compared to artificial intelligence machines. But this issue is used everywhere. I mean, you go to the ATM machine, there is an algorithm there. You go shopping, there is an algorithm there. You drive a car, there is an algorithm there. Your GPS, an algorithm. You surface the internet, that certainly they have their own algorithm that does for you, prioritize for you information. The second thing, they classify information. They make association with you, with your liking or not, and they filter information to fit your own needs. And yeah.
Okay, thanks. A question for Karen Thompson from the ACLU. From your perspective and the ACLU's perspective, what's the problem with this technology, and can those problems be mitigated? Can they become acceptable to you, these technologies?
Well, obviously, artificial intelligence can be used for good. I don't think anyone's saying don't ever use this. There's no way to move forward. But any use of it has to be grounded very firmly with liberty and equality and fairness principles galvanizing its use. And I think the problem that we're facing right now is that the things that make that possible aren't in place. We're really in this kind of embryonic phase of regulation. I mean, the technology has been around for decades and been used for decades, but the regulation around it is very, very flimsy. And so to make artificial intelligence not a harmful weapon, right, but a good tool, we have to make sure that there's due process. The government needs to be very clear about giving individuals a meaningful way to challenge its predictions, its assessments, and the information it turns out. There has to be transparency. We need to know how it's being used and on whom it's being used. And there has to be that non-discriminatory application, which means that we have to weed out the biases to ensure that any of those questions that Dr. Nasser talked about are identified and addressed. And Attorney General Grewal mentioned eyewitness identification and how it's led to 69% of the wrongful convictions that we know about. But what started happening is that organizations started fighting for very strict protocols when you use eyewitness identification to mitigate those harms and to make sure that they don't happen. That's not happening here with AI. And in fact, it's getting more and more widespread. There's this kind of mission creep that is getting so pervasive that I don't even know that people recognize the level of invasiveness that they're facing with these technologies. New Jersey is an amazing state. It has protections for individuals around the expectations of privacy with their location data that are stronger than many other states. Our Constitution has a much broader protection than the federal Constitution, right? But unfortunately, I think we're losing that. We're losing the strength of those protections because we're kind of giving it up automatically with this constant use. And this isn't quite AI, but I think it's a good example of how pervasive things are getting. In Newark, New Jersey, there's something called a Citizen Virtual Patrol Program. And it is a mass surveillance project where the Newark Police Department, without really consulting with people, without legislation, installed cameras all over the city, which has happened before. It happened in Camden. But what's different here is that all of the links, all of the feeds to these cameras that are in a 90% Black city are accessible by anyone who has a computer, anyone who has a laptop, right? And we say that this is great under the guise of keeping people safe, but is it? Do we know that it is? Is it dropping crime statistics? Is it solving crimes? Is it doing any of those things? Or is it just priming people to be surveyed and to make them believe that that surveillance is in their best interest, when not only is it not in their best interest, but it's infringing and eroding the rights that they do have?
You know, in my own career, I can tell you that when people see numbers coming out of a computer, there is an illusion of accuracy. And even in financial reports, people tend to just assume it must be accurate if it came out of the computer. Now, we're getting a lot of questions already from the audience, and I'd like to bring some of them up. And a couple of them are sort of technical questions for the Attorney General. So are there controls at this only at the local level, or are there also national controls? And a related question, in terms of your ability to tell police departments what they can do you have control over all police agencies in the state, or just the state police, or what?
Yes, I'll start with the second question first. The answer to that is that I have the ability to issue Attorney General directives, which have the effect of being binding on all law enforcement agencies in the state and all law enforcement officers. So all 38,000 law enforcement officers, 530 plus law enforcement agencies. And so that's the process we're undertaking right now. And I think, again, I'm not here to defend the widespread use of facial recognition technology or AI, but I just want to make sure we're conflating a lot of different issues, right? We're talking about surveillance in Newark, which is just, the presence of cameras. They're not running that against databases or things like that, facial recognition databases. We're talking about AI being used by other government agencies for whatever purposes. Law enforcement in New Jersey, we have a state police facial recognition database that we use at the ROC, which is our Regional Operation Intelligence Center. The process we're undertaking right now, again, there's no widespread use of this technology in law enforcement. We're putting guardrails on it. We want to figure out what's the baseline level of reliability that these products should have. If you're a law enforcement agency that wants to use an algorithm, it needs to be approved. We want to make sure that there's a false positive rate of to be determined. That's a process we're going through right now across all races and gender. We don't want to have a biased product. And I think the technology is getting there where they're eliminating to a degree these biases. And NIST, which is the organization, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, does this study. They study the algorithms, they test it, and they get that baseline level of reliability to a certain point, and they rate all these algorithms. So we're doing that. We also want to make sure that the product's image gallery is not scraped from social media, against people's, expectations of privacy. We want to know where the images are coming from. We want the providers to certify that they're not going to engage in these unfair types of practices. And then we want a way to, to make sure that we're staying on top of these technology providers, that we review their certifications. But then again, we want to use it, if at all, in 3 or 4 narrow circumstances. One, to identify individuals, as I said earlier, who are deceased or lack capacity to self-identify themselves. We want to use it to prevent if there's a threat of imminent danger or harm in that type of case. And then for investigations, when we don't have other ways to move that investigation along, we think it's okay in those situations to use it as a tool to take a lawfully obtained image, a probe image, whether it's from one of those cameras where you have an image of somebody doing something bad and you're trying to figure out who that is, and you run it then because you have no other way to identify them, and to figure out how we could identify this person to further the investigation. That in and of itself, we don't want to use to arrest somebody. We don't want to use as a search warrant. So I'm just saying that these are the, there might be wide scale bad uses in a lot of industries. We don't want to be one of them. We show people who come in to do a photo array, they'll get a book of images, right? They'll get a book of images in which we'll have one of the suspects and then other images from it, the same databases in some cases, printed out on paper, and we're having humans identify this. And then we record when they misidentify or when they don't identify the right person. And we have disclosure obligations, and there are a lot of rules imposed upon those processes. We're trying to put the same types of guardrails, preserving, false positives, trying to provide information and discovery about the products that we've approved, what the baseline levels of reliability we're okay with. That process is ongoing right now. That'll come in the form of a directive if we're going to go down this route, and we're still exploring that. And that's going to guide law enforcement use of this technology in this state. Those are the rules that Karen says don't exist. She's absolutely right. We don't have guardrails on this technology. And for these purposes, we want to put guardrails on this technology.
So Professor Nasser, I know you had your hand up. Let me just ask the Attorney General one quick follow-up question. So there was a case in Woodbridge, I think, where a guy was arrested apparently only on the basis of a AI match. And he's...
there was a photo generated from an AI match, then shown to somebody who interacted with that person, and that person says, yes, that photo is the person who came in to rent this car. It was later determined to be wrong. That's what I mentioned earlier, a bad match and then a bad identification of that match. So it's multiple layers to that issue. And we don't, listen, I don't think facial recognition results should be used for probable cause, for search or for arrest. I don't think they should be introduced at trial because of all these issues that we've identified. But I do think in narrow circumstances with guardrails on their use, they are an important tool to generate leads. We saw that at the Capitol in identifying the insurrectionists. That technology, I'm certain, was used by the FBI to identify some folks, but we need to put limits on it. It was never just that technology. It was then taking it to people, developing leads, getting search warrants for email accounts to identify their chatter about their role in the insurrection. So again, one piece in an investigative chain. I think with appropriate limits, it's okay.
And within New Jersey, you have the power to enforce that.
I do. I can't put my kids to bed who are still up, but I could do that.
You're not alone in that. Professor Nasser, I know you wanted to make some comment.
I think the issue goes beyond the law enforcement agencies. Artificial intelligence is used, as I mentioned, in zillion fields. And we as human beings become harvests, and our data is sold for money. And that's something is really alarming, because it's when my data, if I'm working with a bank and the bank sells my information to another grocery store, and the grocery store start sending me ads or commercials every second day. That's an invasion of my privacy. That's a waste of my time. I become the product instead of I being the consumer. So in this case, the federal government needs to intervene and pass legislation. The irony or the tragedy is that in a recent study, they found that 70% of all congressmen, they have little to no knowledge about artificial intelligence. So in this case, you cannot really pass pass legislations that will deal with this issue of artificial intelligence in general in society.
Sorry.
If I may just say one word. We have the intelligence, we have the knowledge to produce machines. We are following efficiency because we are all the time making those machines in order to increase efficiency and productivity to make more profit. But we forget in the first place that we invented those machines to make human lives better. We kind of flipped the issue now. We forgot about humans. Humans become a tool, become a product in this process of artificial intelligence and advancement technologies. We need to raise the philosophical and moral issues about the human needs, the human privacy, the human dignity, all those issues worth kind of focusing on instead of focusing on efficiency all the time, because which is the driving force of those advancements in technologies all the time, and the artificial intelligence and the new robots that will amuse you, and you tell them how to turn your TV on or to turn your oven off.
I definitely want to come back to the general issue of privacy. But first, Karen Thompson, so what would you like to see done? What in New Jersey and nationally? And I also want to mention, for the benefit of our audience, that Ms. Thompson came from the Innocence Project, and I think she could have a lot to say about the problems with eyewitness testimony. It's a different topic, but you're probably an expert on that. But anyway, so what would the ACLU like to see done with this?
I think the first thing that we have to remember is that New Jersey has the dubious honor of having one of the largest racial discrepancies in its prisons. And that happens because of policing, right? So all of our best intentions, all of our desires to put some sort of scaffolding around AI has to be read within the context of racial discrimination and the over-policing of Black and Brown communities and Black and Brown bodies. And that is the reality of our world. And unfortunately, technology is usually used in service of making sure that that over-policing doesn't end. And so I think we can't really even talk about this without talking about how racism affects not only the technology, but how it's applied. And the applications are not arbitrary. And I think the documentary did a very good job of showing how very precisely things are kind of tried out in certain communities. That being said, New Jersey has recently had Andrew Zwicker, one of our assembly people, sponsor a bill, A4211, which just cleared committee at the end of January. And we're excited about it because what it's going to do is put a moratorium and press pause on all biometric data collection and surveillance tech. It's doing quite a few things that are pretty great. It expands the breadth of the technologies that we're considering. So it's not just facial recognition, but it's also about iris recognition, which New Jersey schools were considering using as a security tool. It's about prohibiting the prohibited activities, that is like acquiring, possessing, collecting all of this information. It prohibits certain trades of that information. It gives a private cause of action to citizens. So if something's done in violation of the moratorium, there's a right to contest it. There's a suppression clause so that the data can't be used if it is collected within the criminal context. And the moratorium doesn't have an arbitrary date. It doesn't say, oh yes, by next year, let's go with the AI. It says, no, we need to have all the time necessary to investigate And we're not going to put a stop to that until the investigation has been done. So this bill is a great start, but it's a floor. It's not a ceiling. And there's much more that needs to be done to shield residents from these maybe unintended but consequential consequences. And although I'm very happy that Clearview is no longer being used, the fact is police departments across the state were deploying it and harnessing that information. So I think the only thing I would add to that is that we need to make sure that anyone who is studying these issues is very skilled and highly kind of educated about these issues, because like we said before, and like the documentary was clear, the people who made it don't even know what the issues are. So we need to make sure that the eyes that are on this are eyes who can make very clear contributions that will help us put all of these guardrails together and protect the citizenry. Because the fact is, you know, Mr. Parks was arrested. He went to jail. And this was a mistake, yes, but it is trauma. And you know what we have to recognize is all of these activities inflict trauma on people, and it's usually trauma on Black and Brown people. And I was very struck, one of the scenes in the documentary that really kind of resonated and I really felt was the young boy who was pulled over by the police because they say that there's some facial recognition. They thought he was someone else. The child is crying, right? And this is what always kind of gets erased from the conversation. These things cause trauma, and part of our responsibility in regulating the use of artificial intelligence is making sure communities are not subjected to that.
That was certainly a very dramatic scene. I really noticed that. And I have a follow-up question for you. In the film, and I know this is in the longer version of the film, I'm not certain it's in the one we saw tonight. The computer scientist, Joy Buolamwini, related how she went to IBM and gave a presentation on the biases of their software. And I guess to her surprise, they went back and they fixed it and they removed the biases. And then the topic was sort of dropped at that moment. So my question to you is this, and this is also a question for the Attorney General. Let's say the bias is taken out and these algorithms are just as accurate on Black and Brown people and women as they are on white men. Does that mean we have no problem with it? Should we feel free to use it? First you, Ms. Thompson, and then the Attorney General.
No, because there's still questions of privacy. There's still questions of what's happening with the data. There's still, very fundamental issues about abuses. So great, you're accurate, but now we're just going to abuse you accurately. Like that's not the way to go. So I think the problem is the pervasiveness of it. It's getting to the point where it's very hard for us to kind of disaggregate ourselves from these forms of science. This is slightly tangential, but recently the appellate division issued an opinion on the use of something called True Allele, which is a algorithm that analyzes complex DNA mixtures, right? But it's an algorithm, and part of the entire lawsuit was about being able to see the source code of that algorithm, which was being fought by the company, right? So there are all sorts of ways to enter into a criminal justice discussion and question about how algorithms and artificial intelligence are inflecting how we are doing the work of criminal justice. And so I don't know that I have a good answer for it. I just don't think that precision is the answer.
Attorney General, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that's the end of it at all. And I agree with Karen. And I think, we want to use the most reliable tool on whatever metric or standard, but still you need to have all the safeguards in place that I outlined before, no matter how infallible we think the tool may be. I just want to hit 2 points. One, Dr. Nasser should take some comfort in knowing when you were talking about artificial intelligence and Congress people, I thought there was a joke in there somewhere. But Assemblyman Zwicker, who introduced this legislation, is a PhD, and he works at the Princeton Plasma Laboratory and is one of the foremost experts on technology in the Assembly, who's writing this legislation and championing it. I do want to hit one point that Karen touched on, I believe, and Dr. Nasser did. The algorithms you were talking to earlier, Dr. Nasser, wasn't around the parole decision, but was on the pretrial release decision, on the bail decision. And when we talk about bias in the criminal justice system, I agree. You know, we could have all the guardrails in place, but when we're working in a biased system, sometimes not even that's enough to fix the system. We have to acknowledge, you know, when we're talking about these algorithms at times, that we are doing our work in the criminal justice system against hundreds of years of history that have infected it with deep systemic biases that have also resulted in many implicit biases that the people who are using these technologies, doing these jobs carry on. One way that manifests, when you look at that, you can have the best tool, the best algorithm. When you're doing a risk assessment based on criminal history, which is the result of sometimes biased policing, it just bias building on top of bias, right? So if the inputs, the criminal history records, when we're saying Black and brown people are incarcerated at a higher rate, that, you know, we've recognized that the war on drugs has failed and that we are now championing the removing mandatory minimums and getting folks out of jail, but yet we're using the same inputs in the tool determining who should go into jail pre-trial. So, you know, the courts will say that these are scientifically validated tools, but it's hard to determine what that means. I think what's important to realize is that decision of the risk assessment tool, whatever number it spits out, a 1, 2, or a 3, 3, and, you know, whatever it is, that is always the starting point. You know, that the judges should never feel bound to that. That is the starting point for them to assess the individual in front of them. And I think early on in criminal justice reform in this state, judges were afraid to deviate from what the algorithm said because they maybe feared prosecutors taking them on appeal or what have you. But I think what you're seeing is what you see in the federal level, where you do an individualized assessment based on the individual's history, their risk of flight, their characteristics, so on and so forth. So, you know, that's where it really presents the bias on top of bias in that risk assessment tool at times when the inputs are generated by a system that has a lot of biases in it.
Professor Nasser, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
But the court system, judges, a recent study showed that judges are not really consistent with their decisions on similar cases. And the judges it depends on the time of the day, depends if they're before lunch or after lunch, or even after a week. You can present the same case to the same judge and the same judge will rule differently. So ruling on there is no consistency in the criminal justice system, in the court system. And if you take that bias and implant it into machines, so you aggravate the situation instead of easing it. Okay, so that certainly will add to more, you know, discrimination against minorities, against women, against working class people, against recent immigrants, whatever the case. So we need, again, I mean, I'm not against, you know, using technology and science. I love technology and science, and I encourage people to use that. But we need to put at the center of our discussion the human being himself or herself. How to protect their privacy, how to protect their dignity, how to avoid misrecognition or misidentification, because the trauma that a person and the stigma that you will carry with yourself for the rest of your life, if you are arrested, nothing will erase it. Okay, so those issues need to be weighed when we consider what kind of technology we are going to use and for what purposes. Okay, is it just for generating and making the system more efficient or more profitable, or we are trying to protect people, protect their property, to protect their dignity, and give them a good life? These are questions that need to be at the center of the discussion before we say, oh, this is a nice tool. You know, like kids when they buy the new iPhone, they never ask themselves, why I need to buy the new iPhone? Is it going to be more useful to me, more helpful, or more kind of, I don't know, appealing, but we mark it because we think that the new is good and the new can solve problems that we cannot solve as human beings.
And it has facial verification technology on it.
That's right.
Sure it verifies the user.
That's true.
Yes. So the doctor's right. And just David, and I'm sure you
go
want to
ahead.
get to a question. I will say this though, understand that that tool was introduced to get rid of a resource-based system where people who, when we had before this risk-based system that we have in New Jersey, where we're trying to make an individualized assessment, we had a resource-based system where if you committed a certain crime, the judge looked at a chart and your bail was this, and if you could pay it, you got out. And defendants who happened to be black and brown who couldn't afford low bails would stay in jail past the amount of time they would spend if they pled guilty. They would plead guilty, and that's what we were trying to fix. But given the thousands of people that go in, we needed some tool to aid in that process, not to be a substitute for that individualized assessment. But I agree, it has to be the individual in front of you, aided by whatever tools that could help you make that individualized determination.
I'd like to move on to the general discussion of privacy, but first we have several people in the audience who would like to know if the Attorney General, can force police departments to report on their use of this, and will you be monitoring that? Several people have asked about that.
We can and we will. And I think, the technology got ahead of us when Clearview started giving out this technology, and that forced us to put a stop on that. We had the existing state system that people were accessing, and we said Clearview and similar technologies. So it wasn't just Clearview, it was these emerging technologies that we put a stop on. But that's something, we have the ability to do statewide surveys of law enforcement, the tools they're using, and put guardrails and rules around the use of different technologies, even outside of facial recognition. I'm talking about the type of ammunition, less than lethal devices, tasers. So we constantly do these surveys to assess what they have, how they're using it. And that's something that's part of the work that's underway right now.
Now, a lot of people are asking about this general question of privacy and the surveillance state. In the film, they talked about what's going on in China and the development of these social credit scores that are developed. In Hong Kong, we read that the Chinese government is using facial recognition technology to monitor protesters. I just read that in Myanmar, they're doing the same thing. And I think a lot of people may be surprised to know that in some ways, that's being done here. A lot of police cars drive around with little cameras on their hoods or on their roof, and those cameras are used to scan license plates. Now, one could argue that that's a good thing because it helps them to find stolen cars or the occupants of cars who may be wanted, but they are just driving around recording every license plate that they see, the identity of it and the position and so forth. So where are we? I'd like to start actually with Karen Thompson. What are your concerns in this regard? And then we can move on to the other guests.
Well, the license plate readers, the automatic license plate readers, the LPRs, they're deeply problematic. And there's a Scarsdale Police Department who had to issue a kind of statement about using them. And I just want to make sure I get this right, that the police department said in a public response, the use of license plate readers is only limited by the officer's imagination. And I think that just goes to show what this means. We already have an issue with stops that are not necessarily backed by reasonable suspicion. So when you have a license plate reader that's just running license plates against hot cars, what it's also doing is just, again, generating massive amounts of data. And in 2012, the ACLU filed a FOIA request to find out exactly how much data was being compiled. And in 2012, there were 2.1 million license plates that have been photographed. Now,
and where is that? Is that in
Jersey City alone?
In Jersey City alone.
Yes. So if you start to kind of just go along with that to the current day, we're talking about 10 million license plates that have been captured. We don't know what's going on with that data. We do know that in 2010, the Attorney General then issued a directive that compelled law enforcement to keep that data for 5 years, and also directed the use of that data, and I'm quoting again, to detect suspicious activities that are consistent with the modus operandi of criminals, which is like some very vague language that basically says, if it looks like a crime to you, then let's make it a crime, right? And the other thing that I think is very tricky about the license plate readers is what you can do when you're reading the licenses. Do we want police officers to show up at a mosque and say, read all the licenses there? Do we want them to show up at abortion clinics and read all the licenses in the parking lot? Do we want them to go to gay bars and do that? Like, there's a real concern about how we're again, collecting this information, and it tracks people, it tracks their locations, it create stories about them that we don't have any control over. We don't know what's going on with them, right? And I think we have to be very concerned about the consent levels here. And I know it's a public thing. I know that people's driver's licenses are they're public, right? But there's a level at which it goes beyond that, and it starts to seep into things that are discomforting. And I think we should really be aware of that creep. Again, it's normalizing access to data that shouldn't be allowed when we can't give consent, and when our privacy rights are, again, being eroded.
Attorney General Grewal, could you address that? Not just in the context of the license plate readers, but if we can do it with license plate readers, and if facial recognition technology was accurate, why not with that? What would be the difference? And what's the current state of the use of this kind of data in New Jersey?
On which type of data? On facial data?
No, like the license plate readers, and if we can do it on that, why couldn't we do it on facial recognition that was accurate?
Yeah, so license plates, there's a 2010 directive, as Karen was talking about, from Attorney General Dow on it, about how it's limited for legitimate law enforcement reasons, for lookouts, things like that. And there's guardrails in that directive on how long the data should be stored and how it's stored. I think it comes down to, and I think Karen alluded to it, do we have a reasonable expectation of privacy in our license plate, which is on our car, right? Which is something that identifies and registers our vehicle with the state. And if I was a law enforcement officer and I had a pen and a paper and I was looking for a car or I saw a suspicious vehicle, I could then take that, come back to the police station, run it against a database. You have technology that allows a law enforcement officer to do it a little bit more quickly. Sometimes we use this for lookouts when we have individuals, for example, today we arrested an individual wanted for 5 murders based on a license plate, and we were able to identify where he was, and we had a lookout, and so we were looking for where he was pinging on these license plate readers. And so it's a tool, but I agree. Every tool where we're collecting information, there has to be controls placed on those tools. When we're talking about the collection of images, the wide-scale collection of images, that is not somewhere where we're going as a state from the law enforcement side. So I don't see that happening. That I told you at the outset, like the sort of dragnet technology where we're out there collecting people's faces, their images, and running them against databases. That's not where we're headed in this state. And why is it different from the license plate? I think one's an inanimate object, the other's a human being. And so, I think that the dystopian narratives that are forwarded in this movie, I think they resonate with all of us on the law enforcement side, on the civil liberties side, on the academic side. And we realize this is a step too far. And go ahead.
Sorry, no. Do you know, I'm sure you talked to your colleagues, the other attorneys general. What are other states doing?
About half of them I talked to.
What?
The other half talk to me, half don't talk to me. About half of them sue me, and we sue about half of them.
Well, I think maybe you answered my question, which was what are other states doing?
Couple of things. One, I think we have to realize that the New Jersey Attorney General is unique, not because I'm the New Jersey Attorney General, but because our authorities are a little bit more unique than others. No other Attorney General has the broad law enforcement oversight authority that I have in this state by our laws and by our case law. And so very few of them are able to issue directives that are binding on law enforcement. Very few of them, if any of them, can do that. Very few of them have oversight over all law enforcement. Delaware does, because partially it's a small state, smaller population than Bergen County. And so, they have oversight over their local prosecutors, and they could do something similar. So not many others are doing it in the way we're trying to do it with these rules. You'll see a lot of policies are at the departmental level in other states. So once, the New York Police Department may have a policy, but Rochester may not. And so, that's the type of uniformity that we're able to have given our structure in New Jersey. So I'm not aware of any other AGs implementing policies like these. On the consumer protection side that the professor talked about earlier, we are holding those platforms and companies that harvest data and violate terms of use, that don't maintain data in a way that protects their consumers. We're holding them accountable through, whether they're breaches of our data privacy laws, whether it's through concerted actions, or whether it's through our bully pulpit, in particular Facebook and Twitter. I can't stress this enough. We've been raising the alarm for the last 4 years that these algorithms that they use to monetize their platforms, that drive people towards preferred content, are the same algorithms that are driving white supremacists to find community on Facebook in sort of the dark. They're no longer in the dark recesses of the internet. They're in chat groups, and they're in closed groups, and that's allowing hate to be normalized. And that hate being normalized is leading to what we saw culminate on January 6th, in large part, in the rise of bias offenses across our country over the last 3 years. So that's another dangerous place where their algorithms that they use to profit are also having a detrimental effect in an increase in bias offenses in our state. And
that's worth another session, a couple of movies and a couple of talkbacks. We only have about 5 minutes left. Professor Nasser, can you talk a little bit about that issue of how the algorithms can drive some of the worst features of human behavior?
Well, first of all, I would like to share with you that I was in China. For 5 weeks, I taught a summer course there. And I was shocked to see the surveillance in every place you walk, in the hotel, on the streets, in grocery stores, in park, in the buses, in taxis that you take, everywhere. And they devise also this system of personal scores, the more which will reward you, allow you to buy more and to travel abroad. But if you violate some of the rules, then you will be deprived from traveling. You will be deprived from getting a loan for your house, or education, or health services, or many other issues. The surprising issue is that in China, it's very obvious. It's visible. It's out there. And if you want to really to commit a crime, you know where the cameras are, so you can avoid it. In Western societies, all those devices are hidden from us. We don't really see them. The minute we use a computer, somebody is watching what we read. The minute we turn on our phone, someone knows exactly where we are, when we drive our car, what we shop for, everything. So the surveillance is hidden. And the best thing for citizens to protect themselves is to be more educated. I think this is the best tool or the best advice that I can give you. Not to avoid using technology, but to use technology wisely. You need to be educated and to learn how the technology works, how they harvest your information, whatever you do, even when you go shopping, buy your bread. There is a record that says you bought a bread, and next time they will know what kind of bread to offer you a discount on.
So I think just to tag on to that, I think
go
one
ahead.
of the things that we need to do, one of the guardrails, is that we need to make it very explicit that people are able to give consent. So yes, there might be, this handprint to buy a loaf of bread, but to buy it, I have to give you my consent to use my handprint, right? And so at least that, to go to Dr. Nasser's point, it starts to create some sort of
awareness,
visceral awareness for people about how deeply rooted the AI is in their daily goings on.
Right.
We've become so irresponsible with our privacy too. I don't know where I heard this. I've been hearing this commercial on the radio where they've been talking about like, oh, listen, I got the free buffet this morning. All I had to give them was my date of birth. I've got like this. All I had to give them was, my social security number or my phone number. And, I think we put a lot of informational messages out there. These folks who harvest this information, whether it's fake employment scams where you get a targeted email, just send me all this information and, I'll send you information about this job. We just, that's a little bit different. It's a criminal targeting an individual, but, I don't have a personal social media, sort of profile. I have an official one. My children aren't on social media. Like you have to be a little bit mindful. And we just get too casual with it, I think, at times.
But also people have to be aware of what to use or to share on social media. In particular, sometimes I do have an account on social media, and sometimes I see people post, private images about their life, about what they're doing, what they wear, and who is connected with who. I mean, why you need to share that with the world? Share it with your family, with your friends, but not explicit. Someone will harvest that information and may misuse that against you someday.
Well, I think that ship has sailed. Unfortunately, I think we've entered, we are now.
I've seen your library. You've seen my office. I've seen your living room.
Exactly.
I have a sense for David's art now in this Zoom
That's
world.
right. Well,
once again,
there is nowhere to hide.
There's an expression or a phrase that gamblers use that if you're sitting at the poker table, looking around trying to figure out who the mark is, it's you. And I think we are in that situation in many ways with social media because we're looking to see, well, who should we blame? Well, we should blame ourselves. But on that note, I think we have to end. We are out of time. This has been a terrific discussion that could have gone on another hour. And I hope that the TNEC Film Festival will continue with, and PBS and Indie Lens will continue with films along those lines so that we can have you all back. I'd like to thank Attorney General Grewal. Thank you so much for coming tonight. It was really an honor to have you.
My pleasure.
I'd like to thank Karen Thompson from the ACLU.
Thanks for having me.
It was just great having you here. Thank you. And I'd like to thank Professor Nasser also for coming and giving your time for us. And thank you all. And I couldn't even get to not even half the questions that our audience asked. So we had a very engaged audience tonight. Thank you all very much and have a good evening.
Thank you.